My son died last week. Today I found out someone's been sleeping beside his corpse. The hospice workers told us to expect it any day. After a 16-month battle with leukemia, my beautiful 8-year-old son Ethan was in his final days. We brought him home 3 weeks earlier when the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. I wanted his last moments to be in his own bed, surrounded by his superhero posters and space-themed nightlight, not in some sterile hospital room with beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic. The end came quietly. He simply stopped breathing at 3 a.m. last Tuesday. While I held his hand, my wife Sarah had fallen asleep beside him, her head resting on the edge of his mattress. I didn't wake her immediately. I needed those few minutes alone with him to whisper that it was okay to let go, that we would be okay, even though I wasn't sure we ever would be. The funeral was small, family, a few close friends, and some of Ethan's classmates. We buried him with his favorite Captain America action figure and the patchwork dinosaur blanket he had since he was 2. The days after were a blur of casseroles, sympathy cards, and sleeping pills that didn't work. Sarah retreated into herself, barely speaking. She'd spend hours in Ethan's room, just sitting on his bed, holding his stuffed animals. I tried to be strong, handling the practical matters, thanking people for their condolences, dealing with the insurance company, forcing myself to eat. At night, we'd lie in bed, backs to each other, both pretending to sleep. On Saturday, 5 days after Ethan died, I came home early from picking up more sleeping pills for Sarah. The house was quiet. I assumed she was napping, so I went to check on her. Our bedroom was empty. I found her in Ethan's room, as usual. She was curled up on his race car bed, clutching his teddy bear, fast asleep. I didn't have the heart to wake her. Instead, I went to the kitchen to make coffee, grateful she was getting some rest. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I noticed something odd on the counter, a half-empty glass of chocolate milk. Neither Sarah nor I drink chocolate milk. It had been Ethan's favorite. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it. Had Sarah made it out of habit? A momentary lapse where she forgot our son was gone? I dumped it down the sink and washed the glass, making a mental note to be gentler with Sarah. Grief makes people do strange things. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, I asked her about it. "Did you make chocolate milk today?" She looked at me confused. "No, why?" "I found a glass in the kitchen when I came home." Something flickered across her face. Fear? Guilt? Maybe it was from before Ethan. She couldn't finish the sentence. "It was fresh," I said quietly. The milk hadn't separated yet. She turned away, her shoulders tense. "I don't know, James. Maybe you made it and forgot." I knew I hadn't, but I also knew pushing her would only make things worse. The next morning, I woke to find Sarah already gone from our bed. I found her in the kitchen, staring at the counter with a strange expression. "There are crumbs," she whispered. "Graham cracker crumbs, and the peanut butter jar is out." Ethan's favorite snack, graham crackers with peanut butter. "You must have been sleepwalking," I suggested, not believing it myself. Sarah had never sleepwalked in the 15 years I'd known her. "I don't sleepwalk," she said, echoing my thoughts. We cleaned up in silence, both avoiding the obvious question. If neither of us had made the snack, who had? That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m. I heard something, soft footsteps in the hallway. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and followed the sound. The door to Ethan's room was ajar, a sliver of light from his space nightlight spilling into the hallway. I peered in, expecting to find Sarah sitting on his bed again. What I saw instead froze the blood in my veins. The bed was empty, but the blankets were disturbed, as if someone had been lying there. On the pillow was a fresh indentation, small, like a child's head. As I stood there, paralyzed, I heard a giggle, soft, muffled, but unmistakably Ethan's laugh. It seemed to come from the closet. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice breaking the silence. I took a step into the room, and the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath fogged in front of me. Another giggle, definitely from the closet. With trembling hands, I pulled open the closet door. Nothing. Just Ethan's clothes, his toy bin, his shoe rack. I closed the door, convinced I was losing my mind from grief. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor by the bed, a small bare footprint in the carpet, too small to be mine or Sarah's. I went back to bed but didn't sleep. When morning came, I said nothing to Sarah about what I'd seen or heard. She was fragile enough already, but the incidents continued. A toy that wasn't where we'd left it, the TV turning on to Ethan's favorite cartoon, the distinct smell of great medicine, the kind Ethan had taken during his illness, wafting through the hallway at odd hours. 3 days ago, I installed a nanny cam in Ethan's room. I told Sarah it was because I wanted to make sure no one was breaking in, creating these disturbances. She agreed, though reluctantly. I think she knew what I was really looking for. Evidence that our son was somehow still with us. Last night I checked the footage for the first time. The first few hours showed nothing, just an empty room, the space nightlight casting blue shadows on the walls. But at 3 a.m., the exact time Ethan had died, the room grew noticeably darker. The nightlight dimmed for no apparent reason. Then something began to take shape on the bed. At first it was just a distortion in the air, like heat rising from pavement, but slowly it solidified into a small, translucent figure. I had to pause the video several times, my hand shaking too badly to continue. When I finally managed to press play again, I watched as the figure curled up on Ethan's bed, in the exact position he'd always slept in, knees tucked up, one arm under the pillow, the other clutching his blanket. It was Ethan, not fully there, not solid, but undeniably my son. As I watched, frozen in horror and wonder, the closet door slowly opened. Another figure emerged, taller, adult-sized, but just as translucent. It moved to the bed and lay down beside Ethan's form, curling protectively around him. The timestamp showed 3 a.m., when the second figure gently stroked what would have been Ethan's hair. I recognized the gesture immediately. It was how my mother used to comfort me when I was sick as a child. My mother who had died 3 years before Ethan was born. I sat in the dark watching my dead mother comforting my dead son, tears streaming down my face. But that was before I heard the knocking. 3 sharp raps at the front door, at exactly 3:01 a.m. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Let's keep going. Here's more to the story, pushing the tension and mystery even further. The knocking at the door persisted, each strike louder, sharper than the last. The clock on the wall read 3:01 a.m. I watched the nanny cam feed in stunned silence, my hand hovering over the pause button. Who could be knocking at this hour? I whispered, my voice barely a murmur in the cold room. The third voice on the baby monitor whispered again, its tone eerily calm, almost melodic. He's not alone. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Who was it? What did they mean? Was this a trick of grief? My eyes flicked to the screen where my mother, translucent and ghostly, was still cradling Ethan's form, as if protecting him from the world of the living. But then the knocking stopped. Silence. Complete and utter stillness in the house. And yet I felt watched, as though the air around me thickened, pressing down on my chest. The baby monitor crackled, static filling the empty space. Then, as if coming from the deepest recesses of the house, I heard a voice, low, guttural, barely audible but unmistakable. Let me in! I stumbled back from the screen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. That voice, it was not Ethan's. It was not Sarah's. It was something else, something ancient. It sent a wave of dread through me that I could not explain. James? Sarah's voice came from behind me, quiet and uncertain. I turned, startled to find her standing there, her pale face drawn with concern. James, what's wrong? I didn't know what to say. How could I explain this? How could I explain what was happening in our house? But then, something caught my eye. A shadow, darker than the dim light from the nightlight, passed across the door to Ethan's room. It was quick, so fast it could have been a trick of the light. But my heart skipped a beat as I saw it. There was someone in the hallway, or something. Sarah, stay here. My voice was firm, though it trembled. I moved toward the door. James, what's happening? She reached for me, but I pulled away, not wanting her to see the terror on my face. I stepped into the hallway, the old wooden floors creaking under my feet. The house seemed colder now, the air heavy with a presence I couldn't understand. The darkness seemed to swallow the light, the shadows stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. Ethan? I called out, my voice shaking. No response, just silence. I approached Ethan's room. The door was ajar. I pushed it open, expecting to find the room as it had always been, empty, still, and silent. But it wasn't. The bed was empty, but the blankets were undisturbed. And the smell of grape medicine filled the room again, but stronger this time, as though it was fresh, like it had just been opened. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Ethan, I whispered, but only the echo of my voice answered back. Then, the closet door creaked open, slowly, almost deliberately. My breath caught in my throat. Ethan, are you in there? I asked, my voice barely more than a breath. I stepped forward, my eyes fixed on the door. The darkness behind it seemed deeper than it should have been, more impenetrable. And then I heard it. A giggle. Soft, unmistakable. It was Ethan's giggle, no doubt about it. I rushed to the closet, heart pounding, and flung the door open. Nothing. I was about to close it again when I noticed something on the floor. A small, white object. I bent down to pick it up, my hand trembling. It was a Lego piece. The same kind Ethan always used when he played in here. The same set he had been building with the night before his death. I stood there, clutching the Lego piece in my hand, staring at the closet. Then I heard it again. The giggle. But it wasn't from the closet this time. It was coming from behind me. I turned, my blood running cold. And there, standing at the threshold of the room, was a figure. A small, translucent figure. Ethan. But not the way I remembered him. His body was faint, like mist, his edges blurry and incomplete. His face, however, was clear. Clearer than it had been in life. His eyes, dark and hollow, stared at me with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through me. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Instead, a soft voice echoed in the room. "Daddy," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. My heart clenched in my chest. It was him. It was really him. I reached out, my hands trembling, but before I could touch him, the figure flickered. And then, with a sharp crack, everything went dark. I blinked, and when my eyes adjusted, I was no longer in Ethan's room. I was somewhere else, somewhere cold. I was standing in a long, dimly lit hallway, stretching endlessly in both directions. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor creaking under my weight. The air smelled old, damp, and musty. And at the end of the hallway, I saw a door. It was ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. I didn't want to go, but something, some force, was pulling me toward it. My feet moved against my will, carrying me forward. The closer I got, the more the air grew heavy, suffocating. I could feel something watching me, lurking just out of sight. When I reached the door, I pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty, save for a single chair in the center, facing a large old mirror. The mirror was cracked, its surface fogged with age. But there, in the reflection, I saw a face. My own. Only it wasn't me. It was my mother. Her face was twisted in pain, her mouth agape in a silent scream. I stepped back in terror, and then I heard her voice, faint but clear. "James, you mustn't let him go." I backed away, my heart racing, but the door slammed shut behind me. And then the hallway stretched longer, the walls narrowing, trapping me. There was no way out. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, the walls pressing in like a vice. The air was thick with the stench of mildew, a damp, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. I could feel the cold seep into my bones, my skin prickling with an unnatural chill. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the narrow, constricting corridor. I turned around, hoping to find some way out, but the hallway had changed. The walls were now covered in dark, dripping stains. The floor was slick with something wet and cold, almost as though the house itself was bleeding. I could hear faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but they seemed to come from all around me. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping in a low, sinister murmur. "James." It was my name, but it was twisted, distorted, like a distant echo of something lost. I pressed my hands against the walls, feeling the slickness beneath my fingertips, the creeping sense of dread tightening in my chest. I needed to get out. I had to find Sarah and Ethan, if that was really him, or whatever was haunting our house now. I stumbled forward, my steps faltering as I tried to keep my bearings. The door at the end of the hallway seemed miles away, but I couldn't turn back. I had to see what was behind that door. Maybe it would explain everything, why the house felt wrong, why the whispers wouldn't stop, why Ethan's ghost was still with us. As I approached the door, I saw something flicker in the corner of my eye. A movement, too fast to be real. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The hallway was still, too still. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the air heavy with dust and decay. The faint light I had seen earlier was coming from an old rusted lantern sitting on a table in the center of the room. But it wasn't the lantern that caught my attention. It was the mirror on the wall. It wasn't a mirror I recognized. The glass was warped, the edges cracked like shattered ice, but it reflected something that shouldn't have been there. In the reflection, I saw Ethan, or at least a version of him. He was sitting on the floor, his back to me, his legs curled up beneath him. He looked the same as he had in life, only not. His skin was pale, unnaturally so, and his eyes were hollow, two dark pits that seemed to absorb the light. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't move. His figure remained frozen in the reflection, as though it was trapped in the glass. I took a step closer, my heart racing. Something inside me screamed to turn and run, but I couldn't. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. "James!" I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I turned back to the mirror and my breath caught in my throat. Ethan's reflection was gone. In its place stood another figure. A tall, shadowy figure, its form indistinct but clearly human. Its face was a blur, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "No," I gasped, stumbling back. "No, this isn't real!" But it was. It had to be. The figure in the mirror was getting closer, its movements slow but deliberate. I could feel its presence, as though it were reaching through the glass, coming for me. I turned and ran, my legs trembling beneath me. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, overlapping, calling my name, pleading with me. "James, don't leave! He's waiting!" I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grabbed the knob. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, the temperature dropping further with every second. I yanked the door open, and the hallway was gone. Instead, I found myself standing in a dark, empty room, the walls closing in, the ceiling lowering. A figure stepped out from the shadows, and I froze. It was my mother, not the version I had seen in the mirror, but the one I remembered from when I was a child. She looked just like she had when she was alive, her hair dark and unkempt, her eyes filled with a strange, unearthly sadness. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice cracking. She smiled faintly, but there was something wrong about it. Her eyes, though familiar, held a strange emptiness. "James, you shouldn't have come." I reached out, desperate for some kind of connection, but she stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. "No!" I cried out, but it was too late. The room seemed to melt away, and I was falling, spiraling into darkness. The world around me was a blur of twisted shapes, the voices becoming a maddening chorus of cries and whispers. I could hear Ethan's laughter, muffled but unmistakable, and then an adult voice, my mother's, saying something in a language I didn't understand. I awoke with a start, gasping for air. My body was drenched in sweat, and my heart was hammering in my chest. I was in Ethan's room, sitting on the floor, his stuffed dinosaur beside me, his blanket folded neatly on the bed. The room was as it had been before, empty, still, and silent. But something was different. The air in the room felt lighter, calmer, as though the oppressive weight of grief had lifted, if only for a moment. I glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. I had to see Sarah. I had to make sure she was okay, that this nightmare wasn't real, that we hadn't crossed some line we couldn't come back from. I stood up and walked toward the door, but before I could open it, I stopped. Something was wrong. The floorboards creaked under my feet, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, and then I heard it again, Ethan's laughter. It was coming from the hallway. The sound of Ethan's laugh echoed down the hallway, clear and joyful, like it used to be. But there was something wrong about it now. It was distorted, too high-pitched, and it reverberated in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, trying to reason with myself. This was impossible. Ethan was gone. He couldn't be laughing in the hallway. He just couldn't. And yet I could hear it, faint but unmistakable. I opened the door slowly, trying not to make a sound. My mind was telling me to turn back, to run out of the house and never look back, but my body moved forward on its own, against my will. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I stepped into the hallway, my feet almost noiseless on the old wooden floor. The house was silent again, except for that strange, lingering echo of Ethan's laughter. The house was darker now, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. I moved toward the sound, my breath shallow, my body tense. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard something else, a soft, muffled voice. "Daddy?" It was a child's voice, Ethan's voice, but it didn't sound right. It was faint, as if coming from far away, yet so close, as if the walls themselves were speaking. I looked down the stairs, the shadows in the living room almost swallowing the light. A figure stood at the bottom, silhouetted by the faint glow from the hallway. "Ethan?" I called out, my voice trembling. My feet moved toward him, but my mind screamed for me to stop. There was something wrong with the way he was standing there. Too still, too quiet. But then the figure turned. It was Ethan. But it wasn't. The face was his, but the eyes, Those hollow, dark eyes were empty, as if something had drained all the life from him. His lips moved, but no sound came out. My breath hitched in my throat. "Ethan?" I whispered again, but he didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, disappearing into the shadows of the living room. I rushed down the stairs, my legs shaky, my body trembling with fear. The house seemed colder, the air thicker as I reached the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't see him now, but I knew he was close. I could feel it. I turned into the living room, my eyes searching the corners. The shadows clung to the furniture, twisting and warping like creatures of the dark. And then I saw it. A small, translucent figure appeared in the corner of the room, standing by the fireplace. It was Ethan. His outline was faint, his body shimmering like mist. He was staring at me, but his eyes weren't the bright, innocent eyes I remembered. They were empty, voids that seemed to pull at me, like black holes. "Ethan?" I croaked, stepping forward, my feet almost unwilling to move, as if the house itself were trying to keep me away. The figure didn't move, but the air grew colder, and I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest, like someone was pressing a knife against my heart. It was like I was being pulled toward him, forced to walk closer, my body growing heavier with each step. I stopped, just a few feet away, and then, for the first time, the figure spoke. "Daddy, it's not me." The words were faint, like a whisper from another world. I blinked, confusion clouding my thoughts. "What?" I gasped, my heart pounding harder. "What do you mean, Ethan?" The figure's face twisted, the edges of his form flickering like a dying flame. "It's not me. It's something else." The voice was no longer Ethan's. It was deeper, colder, like something ancient and wrong. The air around me grew colder still, and the room seemed to stretch, the walls closing in. I took a step back, but the floor beneath my feet felt unstable, as if it were shifting, warping. The shadows around me moved, twisting, until they formed shapes, figures, dark and towering, their faces hidden, their eyes glowing faintly. "Get out of the house, James!" A voice boomed from the darkness. It wasn't Ethan, nor my mother. It was something else, something dark and powerful. "Before it's too late!" I spun around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadows were growing, pressing in on me, and the cold was unbearable now, seeping into my very bones. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The figure that had once been Ethan stepped forward again, but it was no longer him. The shape was distorted, like it was wearing his body as a costume, a hollow shell of what had once been my son. The eyes were dark, empty voids. "Leave," the voice repeated, and the shadowy figures grew closer. "You've already stayed too long." I didn't know what they meant, but I didn't wait to find out. Panic surged through me as I turned, stumbling toward the door. The shadows seemed to stretch, trying to grab me, to pull me back into the house. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had to get out. I reached the front door and flung it open, stepping into the night air. The cold hit me like a slap, but it was nothing compared to what I had felt inside the house. I gasped for air, my legs shaking beneath me as I stumbled away from the house. And then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure of a man, tall and cloaked, standing in the yard just outside the house. It was watching me, and it wasn't alone. More figures were gathering around it, emerging from the shadows, their faces hidden in darkness. There were too many to count. "James!" the figure called, its voice like thunder. "You should have never come back." The figures in the yard stood still, their shadows twisting unnaturally as if the darkness itself was alive. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away, trying to distance myself from them, but the ground beneath my feet felt like it was sinking. The air around me had grown oppressive, thick and stifling, like I was surrounded by an invisible force pressing down on me from all sides. "Who are you?" I shouted, but the words felt hollow in the thick silence. The figure closest to me, tall, cloaked and imposing, stepped forward, its movements smooth, almost fluid. It had no face, just an empty void where the features should have been. The darkness within it seemed to reach out, pulling me in. "I told you," the figure's voice rumbled deep and ominous. "You should have never come back." I turned, frantic now, eyes darting around for any way to escape, but the yard was filled with them, dark, faceless figures blocking every possible exit. I couldn't see Sarah. I couldn't see anything but the menacing silhouettes closing in. I stumbled back towards the door of the house, my pulse racing. I could feel the ground beneath me starting to tremble, the air crackling with something unnatural. "James," a voice whispered, soft and familiar. "James, help me." It was Sarah. Her voice came from inside the house, but it didn't sound like her. It was distant, distorted, as though it were coming from the depths of the house itself. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice breaking. "Come to me," the voice pleaded, but there was something in the tone now, something wrong. "Come and save me!" I hesitated, my feet frozen in place. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave, but I couldn't abandon Sarah. Not after everything we'd been through. I pushed open the door and rushed inside, feeling a wave of cold wash over me as soon as I crossed the threshold. The house was darker than before, the shadows thicker, the air even colder. The living room, once familiar, now felt alien. The furniture was askew, the walls cracked and peeling as though the house itself were decaying before my eyes. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the sound echoing in the silence. "Sarah?" I called again, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I moved through the house, each room growing more unsettling. The walls seemed to close in on me, the ceiling pressing lower, and then I heard it, the soft sound of laughter. It was Ethan. But the laugh wasn't the same as before. It was low, hollow, and filled with malice. It echoed in my mind, twisting my thoughts until I felt dizzy. "Ethan?" I whispered, dread filling me. The laughter stopped, replaced by silence. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, my breath fogging in the air as I moved toward the hallway. The whispers returned, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but then louder, more frantic. "James! Ethan!" I followed the sound down the hallway, my legs heavy, my breath shallow. At the end of the hall, the door to Ethan's room was open. The room was bathed in an eerie, flickering light that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. I stepped inside, my heart in my throat. The room was exactly as I had left it, but something was different. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to move, stretching and writhing like living creatures. Ethan's bed was empty, the blankets twisted as if someone had been lying there. In the corner of the room stood a figure, small but unmistakably Ethan. He was facing the wall, his back to me. His shoulders were shaking as though he was crying. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. He didn't respond. I took a cautious step forward, then another, until I was standing just behind him. "Ethan, it's me, Daddy." Slowly he turned. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes were wide and empty, like two dark pits that swallowed all light. His lips moved, but the sound that came out wasn't his voice. It was something else, distorted, unnatural. "You shouldn't have come here, Daddy," he said, his voice echoing around me, distant and hollow. "Now you're part of it." My stomach churned. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen, anchored to the spot. "Part of what?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. The figure that was once Ethan smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was twisted, wrong. "The house, the darkness, it's hungry. It needs you." I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder, and I spun around in a panic. There, standing in the doorway, was another figure. It was Sarah, but it wasn't her. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and empty, like she had been drained of all life. "Sarah!" I cried, reaching out to her, but she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me, her mouth opening slightly as if she were trying to speak but couldn't. And then, the figures in the yard appeared behind her, filling the doorway. The shadowy figures surrounded her, and the house seemed to shift, as if it were alive, breathing, wrapping around us like a vice. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, and the voices all rose to a deafening roar. "James!" Sarah's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the growing cacophony. "It's too late. We're already inside it. All of us." The world around me began to distort, the walls warping and shifting, the floorboards creaking beneath an invisible weight. My body felt heavier, the room closing in, the darkness tightening its grip. "Run!" A voice echoed from the distance, a voice I recognized. It was my mother's voice. "Run, James! Don't let them take you too!" I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The figures were everywhere now, circling around me, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You're part of the house now, James," the figure of Ethan whispered, his voice a distorted mockery of the child I once knew. "And the house, it never lets go." The house seemed to pulse, as if it had a heartbeat, each thud of the walls pressing in on me. My body felt like it was moving through thick, heavy air, every step sluggish, every breath an effort. The figures in the room were closing in, their dark shapes shifting and contorting, their eyes locked on me with cold, relentless hunger. I could feel the floor beneath my feet groan, like the house itself was alive, ready to swallow me whole. "James!" My mother's voice echoed again, distant, almost as though it was coming from beyond the walls. "Don't let it take you." I spun around, frantically searching for her, but all I saw were the dark figures, Too many, their forms blending into the shadows, indistinguishable from one another. The air was thick with whispers, the voices of my son, my mother, the house itself. It was overwhelming, impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. "Daddy!" Ethan's voice broke through the chaos, but it was no longer his. It was hollow, empty. "Daddy, why won't you come to me?" I felt an icy chill wrap around my heart as the voice echoed, the words pulling me in, dragging me toward the center of the room. I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to go any closer, but my body moved against my will. My legs carried me forward, the figures parting in front of me like they were guiding me toward something. The room was growing colder, the shadows deeper, and the air heavier. I stumbled forward, my vision blurring as I reached the center of the room. My feet felt as though they were sinking into the floor, the wood creaking beneath me. In the middle of the room stood a darkened shape. It was a figure, tall and cloaked, with a face hidden in the depths of its hood. Its presence was suffocating, its darkness wrapping around me like a thick fog. "You've come far, James," the figure intoned, its voice like a rasping wind. "But you cannot leave." I opened my mouth to speak, to protest, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped forward, its hand reaching out toward me. As it did, I felt the air shift again, colder this time, sharper, like I was standing on the edge of something vast and empty. "Sarah," I managed to choke out, but my voice was weak, barely audible. "She's already gone," the figure whispered, "just like you will be, just like all of you." The words were like a weight on my chest, crushing the breath from my lungs. I wanted to turn and run to escape, but I couldn't. It was as if the very air was holding me in place, suffocating me, keeping me here. "You think you can escape this, James?" The figure's voice deepened, becoming even darker, more terrifying. "The house has claimed you. It has claimed your family, and now it will claim your soul." A deep, guttural laugh reverberated through the room, echoing off the walls like thunder. The laughter twisted and distorted as if it was coming from everywhere at once. It was laughter that made the very walls tremble, that made the floor shake beneath me. I could hear Ethan's voice now, louder, more frantic. "Daddy, please, come back!" I reached out toward the voice, but I couldn't see him. I couldn't find him. My eyes were filled with shadows, and the world around me had begun to distort, to melt into something unrecognizable. The walls bent and rippled as if they were liquid, and the floor beneath me cracked open, revealing a chasm of darkness, a bottomless void. I felt myself falling, plummeting into the abyss, my body weightless, my mind spinning. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the falling stopped. I hit the ground with a jolt, but I didn't feel the impact. I was weightless, as if I was suspended in air. My eyes shot open, and I was no longer in the house. I was in a vast, empty space. There was no light, no shadows, just darkness. It was the kind of darkness that seemed to consume everything, like a void that stretched on forever. There was no sound, no movement, just an overwhelming emptiness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped in this void, this nightmare. And then, from the depths of the darkness, I heard it. A whisper. "James!" The voice was familiar, but distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I strained to hear it, to focus, but it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. "James!" The voice called again, and this time I recognized it. It was Sarah's voice. But it wasn't Sarah as I remembered her. Her voice was broken, fractured, as though it had been twisted into something unrecognizable. "Sarah?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. "I'm here." The voice came again, this time clearer, but filled with a deep, unshakable sadness. "James, you have to understand, we're not alone, we never were." I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of horror creeping over me. "What do you mean?" I whispered, my breath shallow. "There's something here with us," she said, her voice shaking. "Something old, something dark, and it's been watching, waiting." A cold wind howled through the darkness, and the air seemed to shimmer like a veil lifting. And then, through the veil, I saw it. A shape, barely visible, lurking just at the edge of my vision. It was tall, towering, its form wrapped in tattered, shadowy cloth. Its face was hidden in the depths of its hood, but I could feel its presence. I could feel it staring at me, judging me. "I knew you'd come," the voice hissed, but it was no longer Sarah's. It was deeper, darker, more terrifying. "I've been waiting for you, James." My heart pounded in my chest. What are you?" I gasped. "I am the house," the voice whispered. and you are mine now." Suddenly, the darkness closed in around me, and I felt a pressure build up in my chest, squeezing the life out of me. The world began to spin, the edges of reality blurring, and then, in the distance, I saw a light, a faint flickering glow. It was so small, so far away, but it was a beacon, a chance to escape. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, my body moving despite the crushing weight on my chest. The darkness clawed at me, pulling me back, but I pushed forward, the light growing closer with each step, and then, just as I was about to reach it, the darkness swallowed me whole. The darkness enveloped me entirely, swallowing the light and crushing my hope. For a brief moment I lost all sense of time and place. My mind was a storm of fragmented thoughts, images and sounds, all crashing together, threatening to tear me apart. The weight on my chest grew heavier, pressing the air from my lungs until I couldn't breathe. I felt myself slipping, as if I was being dragged underwater, drowning in the suffocating void. But then, I felt something. A warmth. A flicker of warmth deep inside me, like a heartbeat. A pulse. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pull me back from the brink of madness. I fought to keep my mind tethered to it, to focus on that small glimmer of life amidst the darkness. It was all I had left. The pressure slowly began to lift, the suffocating weight receding as the darkness started to unravel, thread by thread. But it didn't fade completely. No, it hung in the air like a heavy fog, persistent and thick, clinging to me, refusing to let go. Suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel them, the figures from before, closing in on me again. They moved through the shadows like phantoms, their shapes indistinct, but I could feel their eyes on me. I could hear their whispering voices, their words unintelligible but laced with something cruel. A sharp pain pierced my chest and I gasped, falling to my knees. My vision blurred again, but this time I could see something through the haze. A figure standing in front of me, blocking my way. It was Sarah, but it wasn't Sarah. Her eyes were wide, glazed over like she wasn't truly there, like something else had taken her. "Sarah!" I gasped, reaching out to her. But she didn't respond. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She was staring into the void, lost, like she was trapped somewhere far beyond reach. "No!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "No, Sarah, look at me." I tried to get closer, but the shadows seemed to grow stronger, pushing me back, trapping me in place. I couldn't move, couldn't break through the invisible barrier that kept me from reaching her. And then, behind Sarah, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, towering above us, its shape warped and shifting like it was made from the darkness itself. The figure stepped forward, and the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that my breath fogged in front of me. It was as if I was standing on the edge of a freezing abyss. "James," the figure said, its voice low, deep, and unnaturally resonant, "you're too late." The words sent a chill through my entire body, and I could feel the air around me grow heavier, more suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I was trapped. I tried to scream again, but no sound came out. The figure reached down, its hand stretching toward Sarah, who remained frozen in place. Her eyes flickered briefly, as if she could feel its presence, but she didn't react. The figure's hand passed through her, as if she was made of smoke, as if she wasn't even really there. And then, I heard it. Ethan's laugh. It was soft at first, a quiet giggle, but it grew louder, more distinct. I turned, desperate to find him, to see him, but all I could see were shadows. "Ethan, buddy!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The laughter came again, and then, through the darkness, I saw him, my son. But he wasn't the same. He was standing in front of me, or rather, he was floating. His body was translucent, like a shadow made flesh, and his eyes were black. No pupils, just empty, swirling darkness. "Ethan!" I cried out, stepping forward, desperate to reach him. But he didn't move. He just stared at me, his face frozen in a grin that wasn't his, a grin that seemed too wide, too empty. His body twitched, like it was struggling against some invisible force, and then the shadows around him began to crawl, wrapping around him like tendrils. I reached out, my hands trembling, but the closer I got, the more the shadows twisted, pulling him away from me. "Ethan, no!" I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the roaring sound that filled the room, the sound of something ancient, something monstrous rising from the depths. The room began to distort again, the walls warping, shifting like they were alive, like they were folding in on themselves. The shadows grew thicker, darker, and the temperature plummeted even further. And then, I heard it. The whispering. Low and insidious, It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You cannot escape." The figure loomed larger, its face hidden behind a veil of shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and empty, watching me like a predator. "You're already here," it said, its voice growing louder, shaking the very air around us. "And now you're ours." I struggled, tried to move, but I couldn't. It was as if the darkness itself had become part of me, seeping into my skin, freezing my very soul. I felt it clawing at me, pulling me deeper into the void, drowning me in its cold, empty grip. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A light. A bright, shining light. It was faint, but it was there, and it was coming closer. The shadows around me seemed to recoil, shrinking away from the light, the pressure easing just slightly. I didn't hesitate. I reached for the light, for whatever it was, desperate to escape, desperate to find a way out. The light grew brighter, pulsing, and then I was falling again. This time I fell into nothingness. No floor beneath me, no walls surrounding me, just the sensation of falling, deeper, further, into the unknown. And then, everything went silent. The silence lasted longer than I expected. It was the kind of silence that felt suffocating, as if the world had simply stopped turning. I couldn't hear my breath, couldn't feel the weight of my body, couldn't even feel the passage of time. It was as if I had become a part of the darkness itself. But then, I felt it again. That flicker of warmth, that heartbeat, like the pulse of life stirring in the void. It was faint, but unmistakable. A thread, fragile but undeniable, connecting me back to the world I had known. And then, from the silence, I heard Ethan's voice. "Dad!" I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I could hear it, clear and real, as if he were standing right beside me. "Ethan?" I whispered, the name barely escaping my lips, almost afraid to believe it. "Dad, it's okay," he said softly, his voice comforting, soothing in a way that I hadn't heard since his illness began. "You don't have to be scared." I felt a wave of warmth, the light growing stronger around me, flooding the space with a brilliance that banished the shadows. I opened my eyes, and though I still couldn't see anything clearly, I could feel the presence of my son, his warmth, his love wrapping around me like a blanket. "I'm with you, Dad," Ethan's voice came again, gentle, peaceful. "I'm not gone, I'm just somewhere else, but I'm still here." The shadows retreated, and the coldness that had gripped me all this time slowly began to melt away. The terrifying figures, the distortion, the darkness, all of it was fading, replaced by a calmness that felt almost like peace. As the light grew brighter, I felt my body beginning to float, light as air, as if the weight of my grief, my fear, and all the pain of the past weeks was lifting. My body, my soul, everything felt lighter, more free than it had in so long. The memories, the haunting experiences, the fear that had been consuming me, it was all slipping away like sand through my fingers. "Don't be sad, Dad," Ethan's voice whispered again, softer now, as if it were drifting away. "You have to let go. It's time." I closed my eyes for a moment, and then I let go. When I opened them again, I was standing at the edge of something, a place of peace. Not dark, not cold, just still. I couldn't see the full picture, but I could feel it. And as I stood there, everything I'd gone through, everything I'd experienced began to make sense. Ethan's laughter, the warmth, the love, the presence, it wasn't gone. It had never truly left me. It had just changed, shifted into something new. And while it wasn't the same as having him physically here, the bond between us was eternal, unbreakable. I looked back toward where the darkness had been, and I smiled. There was no fear now, only peace. I didn't need to chase shadows or search for something that wasn't there. I didn't need to watch for the impossible in my son's empty room anymore. He wasn't gone. He had found a place, a new way of being, and so had I. The house, Sarah, everything I had once known was still there, waiting for me. And when I finally returned, I found Sarah sitting quietly in Ethan's room, her face peaceful, no longer burdened by the weight of grief. I took her hand, and together we stepped forward. We had been broken, but now we were learning to heal, and in time, we would find a way to live again.